Preface of The Night Side of Nature, or Ghosts and Ghost-Seers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Maria Luisa Ruiz, Eugene, Oregon. The Night Side of Nature, or Ghosts and Ghost-Seers, by Crowe. Preface. In my late novel of Lily Dawson, I announced my intention of publishing a work to be called The Night Side of Nature. This is it. The term night side of nature I borrow from the Germans, who derive it from the astronomers, the latter denominating that side of a planet which is turned from the sun, its night side. We are in this condition for a certain number of hours out of every 24, and as during this interval external objects loom upon us, but strangely and imperfectly, the Germans draw a parallel between these vague and misty perceptions and the similar obscure and uncertain glimpses we get of that veiled department of nature of which, while comprising as it does the solution of questions concerning us more nearly than any other, we are yet in a state of entire and willful ignorance. For science, at least science in this country, has put it aside as beneath her notice, because new facts that do not fit into old theories are troublesome and not to be countenanced. We are encompassed on all sides by wonders, and we can scarcely set our foot upon the ground without trampling upon some marvelous production that our whole life and all our faculties would not suffice to comprehend. Familiarity, however, renders us insensible to the ordinary works of nature. We are apt to forget the miracles they comprise, and even sometimes, mistaking words for conceptions, commit the error of thinking we understand their mystery. But there is one class of these wonders with which, from their comparatively rare occurrence, we do not become familiar, and these, according to the character of the mind to which they are presented, are frequently either denied as ridiculous and impossible, or received as evidences of supernatural interference, interruptions of those general laws by which God governs the universe, which latter mistake arises from our only seeing these facts without the links that connect them with the rest of nature, just as, in the faint light of a starlit night, we might distinguish the tall mountains that lift their crests high into the sky, though we could not discern the low chain of hills that united them with each other. There are 2 or 3 books by German authors entitled The Night Side or The Night Dominion of Nature, which are on subjects more or less analogous to mine. Heinrich Schubert's is the most celebrated among them. It is a sort of cosmogony of the world, written in a spirit of philosophical mysticism, too much so for English readers in general. In undertaking to write a book on these subjects myself, I wholly disclaim the pretension of teaching or of enforcing opinions. My object is to suggest inquiry and stimulate observation in order that we may endeavor, if possible, to discover something regarding our psychical nature, as it exists here in the flesh, and as it is to exist hereafter out of it. If I could only induce a few capable persons, instead of laughing at these things, to look at them, my object would be attained, and I should consider my time well spent. End of preface. Chapter 1 of The Night Side of Nature, or Ghosts and Ghost-Seers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Maria Luisa Ruiz, Eugene, Oregon. The Night Side of Nature, or Ghosts and Ghost-Seers, by Crowe. Chapter 1. Introduction. Know ye not that ye are the temple of God, and that the Spirit of God dwelleth in you? 1 Corinthians 3:16. Most persons are aware that the Greeks and Romans entertained certain notions regarding the state of the soul, or the immortal part of man, after the death of the body, which have been generally held to be purely mythological. Many of them doubtless are so, and of these I am not about to treat. But among their conceptions there are some which, as they coincide with the opinions of many of the most enlightened persons of the present age, it may be desirable to consider more closely. I allude here particularly to their belief in the tripartite kingdom of the dead. According to this system, there were the Elysian fields, a region in which a certain sort of happiness was enjoyed, and Tartarus, the place of punishment for the wicked, each of which was comparatively but thinly inhabited. But there was also a mid-region peopled with innumerable hosts of wandering and mournful spirits, who, although undergoing no torments, are represented as incessantly bewailing their condition, pining for the life they once enjoyed in the body, longing after the things of the earth, and occupying themselves with the same pursuits and objects as had formerly constituted their business or their pleasure. Old habits are still dear to them, and they cannot snap the link that binds them to the earth. Now, although we cannot believe in the existence of Karun, the three-headed dog, or Alecto, the serpent-haired fury, it may be worthwhile to consider whether the persuasion of the ancients with regard to that which concerns us all so nearly, namely, the destiny that awaits us when we have shaken off this mortal coil, may not have some foundation in truth, whether it might not be a remnant of a tradition transmitted from the earliest inhabitants of the earth, wrested by observation from nature, if not communicated from a higher source, and also whether circumstances of constant recurrence in all ages and in all nations, frequently observed and recorded by persons utterly ignorant of classical lore and unacquainted, indeed, with the dogmas of any creed but their own, do not, as well as various passages in the Scriptures, afford a striking confirmation of this theory of a future life, while it, on the other hand, offers a natural and convenient explanation of their mystery. To minds which can admit nothing but what can be explained and demonstrated, an investigation of this sort must appear perfectly idle. For while on the one hand the most acute intellect or the most powerful logic can throw little light on the subject, it is at the same time, though I have a confident hope that this will not always be the case, equally irreducible within the present bounds of science. Meanwhile, experience, observation, and intuition must be our principal, if not our only, guides. Because in the 17th century credulity outran reason and discretion, the 18th century, by a natural reaction, threw itself into an opposite extreme. Whoever closely observes the signs of the times will be aware that another change is approaching. The contemptuous skepticism of the last age is yielding to a more humble spirit of inquiry, and there is a large class of persons, among the most enlightened of the present, who are beginning to believe that much which they had been taught to reject as fable has been in reality ill-understood truth. Somewhat of the mystery of our own being and of the mysteries that compass us about are beginning to loom upon us, as yet, it is true, but obscurely. And in the endeavor to follow out the clue they offer, we have but a feeble light to guide us. We must grope our way through the dim path before us, ever in danger of being led into error, while we may confidently reckon on being pursued by the shafts of ridicule, that weapon so easy to wield, so potent to the weak, so weak to the wise, which has delayed the births of so many truths, but never stifled one. The Pharisaical skepticism, which denies without investigation, is quite as perilous and much more contemptible than the blind credulity which accepts all that it is taught without inquiry. It is, indeed, but another form of ignorance assuming to be knowledge. And by investigation, I do not mean the hasty, captious, angry notice of an unwelcome fact that too frequently claims the right of pronouncing on a question, but the slow, modest, painstaking examination that is content to wait upon nature and humbly follow out her disclosures, however opposed to preconceived theories or mortifying to human pride. If scientific men could but comprehend how they discredit the science they really profess by their despotic arrogance and exclusive skepticism, they would surely, for the sake of that very science they love, affect more liberality and candor. This reflection, however, naturally suggests another, namely, do they really love science, or is it not too frequently with them but the means to an end? Were the love of science genuine, I suspect it would produce very different fruits to that which we see borne by the tree of knowledge as it flourishes at present. And this suspicion is exceedingly strengthened by the recollection that, among the numerous students and professors of science I have at different times encountered, the real worshippers and genuine lovers of it for its own sake have all been men of the most single, candid, unprejudiced, and inquiring minds, willing to listen to all new suggestions and investigate all new facts, not bold and self-sufficient, but humble and reverent suitors, aware of their own ignorance and unworthiness, and that they are yet but in the primer of nature's works. They do not permit themselves to pronounce upon her disclosures or set limits to her decrees. They are content to admit that things new and unsuspected may yet be true, that, their own knowledge of facts being extremely circumscribed, the systems attempted to be established on such uncertain data must needs be very imperfect and frequently altogether erroneous, and that it is therefore their duty, as it ought to be their pleasure, to welcome as a stranger every gleam of light that appears in the horizon, let it loom from whatever quarter it may. But alas, Poor science has few such lovers. Le boy Yuda sa cassette, I fear, are much more frequently the objects of attraction than her own fair face. The belief in a God and in the immortality of what we call the soul is common to all nations, but our own intellect does not enable us to form any conception of either one or the other. All the information we have on these subjects is comprised in such hints as the Scripture here and there give us. Whatever other conclusions we draw must be the result of observation and experience. Unless founded upon these, the opinion of the most learned theologian or the most profound student of science that ever lived is worth no more than that of any other person. They know nothing whatever about these mysteries, and all a priori reasoning on them is utterly valueless. The only way, therefore, of attaining any glimpses of the truth in an inquiry of this nature, where our intellect can serve us so little, is to enter on it with the conviction that, knowing nothing, we are not entitled to reject any evidence that may be offered to us, till it has been thoroughly sifted and proved to be fallacious. That the facts presented to our notice appear to us absurd and altogether inconsistent with the notions our intellects would have enabled us to form should have no weight whatever in the investigation. Our intellects are no measure of God Almighty's designs. And I must say that I do think one of the most irreverent, dangerous, and sinful things man or woman can be guilty of is to reject with scorn and laughter any intimation which, however strangely it may strike upon our minds, and however adverse it may be to our opinions, may possibly be showing us the way to one of God's truths. Not knowing all the conditions and wanting so many links of the chain, it is impossible for us to pronounce on what is probable and consistent and what is not. And this being the case, I think the time is ripe for drawing attention to certain phenomena, which, under whatever aspect we may consider them, are beyond doubt exceedingly interesting and curious, while, if the view many persons are disposed to take of them be the correct one, they are much more than this. I wish also to make the English public acquainted with the ideas entertained on these subjects by a large proportion of German minds of the highest order. It is a distinctive characteristic of the thinkers of that country that, in the first place, they do think independently and courageously, and in the second, that they never shrink from promulgating the opinions they have been led to form, however new, strange, heterodox, or even absurd they may appear to others. They do not succumb, as people do in this country, to the fear of ridicule, nor are they in danger of the odium that here pursues those who deviate from established notions, and the consequence is that, though many fallacious theories and untenable propositions may be advanced, a great deal of new truth is struck out from the collision, and in the result, as must always be the case, what is true lives and is established, and what is false dies and is forgotten. But here in Britain, our critics and colleagues are in such haste to strangle and put down every new discovery that does not emanate from themselves, or which is not a fulfilling of the ideas of the day, but which, being somewhat opposed to them, promises to be troublesome from requiring new thought to render it intelligible, that one might be induced to suppose them divested of all confidence in this inviolable law, while the more important and the higher the results involved may be, the more angry they are with those who advocate them. They do not quarrel with a new metal or a new plant, and even a new comet or a new island stands a fair chance of being well received. The introduction of a planet appears, from late events, to be more difficult. While phrenology and mesmerism testify that any discovery tending to throw light on what most deeply concerns us, namely our own being, must be prepared to encounter a storm of angry persecution. And one of the evils of this hasty and precipitate opposition is that the passions and interests of the opposers become involved in the dispute. Instead of investigators, they become partisans. Having declared against it in the outset, it is important to their petty interests that the thing shall not be true, and they determine that it shall not if they can help it. Hence these hasty, angry investigations of new facts, and the triumph with which failures are recorded. And hence the willful overlooking of the axiom that 1,000 negatives cannot overthrow the evidence of one affirmative experiment. I always distrust those who have declared themselves strongly in the beginning of a controversy. Opinions which, however rashly avowed, may have been honest at first, may have been changed for many a long day before they are retracted. In the meantime, the march of truth is obstructed, and its triumph is delayed. Timid minds are alarmed. Those who dare not or cannot think for themselves are subdued. There is much needless suffering incurred and much good lost, but the truth goes quietly on its way and reaches the goal at last. With respect to the subjects I am here going to treat of, it is not simply the result of my own reflections and convictions that I am about to offer. On the contrary, I intend to fortify my position by the opinions of many other writers, the chief of whom will, for reasons above given, namely that it is they who have principally attended to the question, be Germans. I am fully aware that in this country a very considerable number of persons lean to some of these opinions, and I think I might venture to assert that I have the majority on my side, as far as regards ghosts. For it is beyond a doubt that many more are disposed to believe than to confess, and those who do confess are not few. The deep interest with which any narration of spiritual appearances bearing the stamp or apparent stamp of authenticity is listened to in every society is one proof that, though the fear of ridicule may suppress, it cannot extinguish that intuitive persuasion of which almost everyone is more or less conscious. I avow that in writing this book I have a higher aim than merely to afford amusement. I wish to engage the earnest attention of my readers, because I am satisfied that the opinions I am about to advocate, seriously entertained, would produce very beneficial results. We are all educated in the belief of a future state, but how vague and ineffective this belief is with the majority of persons we too well know. For although, as I have said above, the number of those who are what is called believers in ghosts and similar phenomena is very large, it is a belief that they allow to sit extremely lightly on their minds. Although they feel that the evidence from within and from without is too strong to be altogether set aside, they have never permitted themselves to weigh the significance of the facts. They are afraid of that bugbear, superstition, a title of opprobrium, which it is very convenient to attach to whatever we do not believe ourselves. They forget that nobody has a right to call any belief superstitious till he can prove that it is unfounded. Now, no one that lives can assert that the reappearance of the dead is impossible. All he has a right to say is that he does not believe it, and the interrogation that should immediately follow this declaration is, have you devoted your life to sifting all the evidence that has been adduced on the other side from the earliest periods of history and tradition? And even though the answer were in the affirmative, and that the investigation had been conscientiously pursued, it would still be a bold inquirer that would think himself entitled to say the question was no longer open. But the rashness and levity with which mankind make professions of believing and disbelieving are, all things considered, phenomena much more extraordinary than the most extraordinary ghost story that ever was related. The truth is that not one person in 1,000, in the proper sense of the word, believes anything. They only fancy they believe because they have never seriously considered the meaning of the word and all that it involves. That which the human mind cannot conceive of is apt to slip from its grasp like water from the hand. And life out of the flesh falls under this category. The observation of any phenomena, therefore, which enabled us to master the idea, must necessarily be extremely beneficial, and it must be remembered that one single, thoroughly well-established instance of the reappearance of a deceased person would not only have this effect, but that it would afford a demonstrative proof of the deepest of all our intuitions, namely, that a future life awaits us. Not to mention the modern Germans of eminence who have devoted themselves to this investigation, there have been men remarkable for intellect in all countries who have considered the subject worthy of inquiry. Among the rest, Plato, Pliny, and Lucian, and in our own country, that good old divine Dr. Henry Moore, Dr. Johnson, Addison, Isaac Taylor, and many others. It may be objected that the eternally quoted case of Nicolai, the bookseller at Berlin, and Dr. Ferriar's theory of apparitions had not then settled the question. But nobody doubts that Nicolai's was a case of disease, and he was well aware of it himself. As it appears to me, everybody so afflicted is. I was acquainted with a poor woman in Edinburgh who suffered from this malady, brought on, I believe, by drinking. But she was perfectly conscious of the nature of the illusions, and that temperance and a doctor were the proper exorcists to lay the spirits. With respect to Dr. Ferriar's book, a more shallow one was assuredly never allowed to settle any question, and his own theory cannot, without the most violent straining and the assistance of what he calls coincidences, meet even half the cases he himself adduces. That such a disease as he describes exists, nobody doubts, but I maintain that there are hundreds of cases on record for which the explanation does not suffice. And if they have been instances of spectral illusion, All that remains to be said is that a fundamental reconstruction of the theory on that subject is demanded. Laplace says, in his essay on probabilities, that any case, however apparently incredible, if it be a recurrent case, is as much entitled, under the laws of induction, to a fair valuation as if it had been more probable beforehand. Now, no one will deny that the case in question possesses this claim to investigation. Determined skeptics may indeed deny that there exists any well-authenticated instance of an apparition, but that, at present, can only be a mere matter of opinion, since many persons, as competent to judge as themselves, maintain the contrary. And in the meantime, I arraign their right to make this objection till they have qualified themselves to do so by a long course of patient and honest inquiry, always remembering that every instance of error or imposition discovered and adduced has no positive value whatever in the argument but as regards that single instance, though it may enforce upon us the necessity of strong evidence and careful investigation. With respect to the evidence, past and present, I must be allowed here to remark on the extreme difficulty of producing it, not to mention the acknowledged carelessness of observers and the alleged incapacity of persons to distinguish between reality and illusion. There is an exceeding shyness in most people who either have seen or fancied they have seen an apparition to speak of it at all, except to some intimate friend, so that one gets most of the stories second-hand. While even those who are less chary of their communications are imperative against their name and authority being given to the public. Besides this, there is a great tendency in most people, after the impression is over, to think they may have been deceived, and where there is no communication or other circumstance rendering this conviction impossible, it is not difficult to acquire it, or at least so much of it as leaves the case valueless. The seer is glad to find this refuge from the unpleasant feelings engendered, while surrounding friends, sometimes from genuine skepticism and sometimes from good nature, almost invariably lean to this explanation of the mystery. In consequence of these difficulties, and those attending the very nature of the phenomena, I freely admit that the facts I shall adduce, as they now stand, can have no scientific value. They cannot, in short, enter into the region of science at all, still less into that of philosophy. Whatever conclusions we may be led to form cannot be founded on pure induction. We must confine ourselves wholly within the region of opinion, if we venture beyond which we shall assuredly founder. In the beginning, all sciences have been but a collection of facts, afterward to be examined, compared, and weighed by intelligent minds. To the vulgar, who do not see the universal law which governs the universe, everything out of the ordinary course of events is a prodigy. But to the enlightened mind there are no prodigies, for it perceives that in both the moral and the physical world there is a chain of uninterrupted connection, and that the most strange and even apparently contradictory or supernatural fact or event will be found, on due investigation, to be strictly dependent on its antecedents. It is possible that there may be a link wanting, and that our investigations may, consequently, be fruitless. But the link is assuredly there, although our imperfect knowledge and limited vision cannot find it. And it is here the proper place to observe that, in undertaking to treat of the phenomena in question, I do not propose to consider them as supernatural. On the contrary, I am persuaded that the time will come when they will be reduced strictly within the bounds of science. It was the tendency of the last age to reject and deny everything they did not understand. I hope it is the growing tendency of the present one to examine what we do not understand. Equally disposed with our predecessors of the 18th century to reject the supernatural and to believe the order of nature inviolable, we are disposed to extend the bounds of nature and science till they comprise within their limits all the phenomena, ordinary and extraordinary, by which we are surrounded. Scarcely a month passes that we do not hear of some new and important discovery in science. It is a domain in which nothing is stable, and every year overthrows some of the hasty and premature theories of the preceding ones. And this will continue to be the case as long as scientific men occupy themselves each with his own subject, without studying the great and primal truths, what the French call la vérité mère, which link the whole together. Meantime, there is a continual unsettling. Truth, if it do not emanate from an acknowledged authority, is generally rejected, and error, if it do, is as often accepted. While whoever disputes the received theory, whatever it be, we mean especially that adopted by the professors of colleges, does it at his peril. But there is a day, yet brooding in the bosom of time, when the sciences will no longer be isolated, when we shall no longer deny, but be able to account for, phenomena apparently prodigious, or have the modesty, if we cannot explain them, to admit that the difficulty arises solely from our own incapacity. The system of centralization in statistics seems to be of doubtful advantage, but a greater degree of centralization appears to be very much needed in the domain of science. Some improvement in this respect might do wonders, particularly if reinforced with a slight infusion of patience and humility into the minds of scientific men, together with the recollection that facts and phenomena which do not depend on our will must be waited for, that we must be at their command, for they will not be at ours. But to return once more to our own subject. If we do believe that a future life awaits us, there can be nothing more natural than the desire to obtain some information as to what manner of life that is to be, for which any one of us may, before this time tomorrow, have exchanged his present mode of being. That there does not exist a greater interest with regard to this question in the mind of man arises partly from the vague, intangible kind of belief he entertains of the fact, partly from his absorption in worldly affairs, and the hard and indigestible food upon which his clerical shepherds pasture him, for, under dogmatic theology, religion seems to have withered away to the mere husk of spiritualism, and partly also from the apparent impossibility of pursuing the inquiry to any purpose. As I said before, observation and experience can alone guide us in such an inquiry, for though most people have a more or less intuitive sense of their own immortality, intuition is silent as to the mode of it. And the question I am anxious here to discuss with my readers is whether we have any facts to observe or any experience from which, on this most interesting of all subjects, a conclusion may be drawn. Great as the difficulty is of producing evidence, it will, I think, be pretty generally admitted that, although each individual case as it stands alone may be comparatively valueless, the amount of recurrent cases forms a body of evidence that, on any other subject, would scarcely be rejected. And since, if the facts are accepted, they imperatively demand an explanation, for assuredly the present theory of spectral illusions cannot comprise them, our inquiry, let it terminate in whatever conclusion it may, cannot be useless or uninteresting. Various views of the phenomena in question may be taken. And although I shall offer my own opinions and the theories and opinions of others, I insist upon none. I do not write to dogmatize, but to suggest reflection and inquiry. The books of Dr. Ferriar, Dr. Hibbert, and Dr. Thatcher, the American, are all written to support one exclusive theory, and they only give such cases as serve to sustain it. They maintain that the whole phenomena are referable to nervous or sanguineous derangement, and are mere subjective illusions, and whatever instance cannot be covered by this theory, they reject as false, or treat as a case of extraordinary coincidence. In short, they arrange the facts to their theory, not their theory to the facts. Their books cannot, therefore, claim to be considered as anything more than essays on a special disease. They have no pretense whatever to the character of investigations. The question, consequently, remains as much an open one as before they treated it, while we have the advantage of their experience and information with regard to the peculiar malady that forms the subject of their works. On that subject it is not my intention to enter. It is strictly a medical one, and every information may be obtained respecting it in the above-named treatises, and others emanating from the faculty. The subjects I do intend to treat of are the various kinds of prophetic dreams, presentiments, second sight, and apparitions, and in short, all that class of phenomena which appears to throw some light on our physical nature, and on the probable state of the soul after death. In this discussion, I shall make free use of my German authorities, Drs. Kerner, Stilling, Werner, Eschenmeier, Ennemoser, Passavent, Schubert, von Meyer, and etc., and etc. And I here make a general acknowledgment to that effect, because it would embarrass my book too much to be constantly giving names and references, although when I quote their words literally, I shall make a point of doing so, and because also that as I have been both thinking and reading much on these subjects for considerable time past, I am in fact no longer in a condition to appropriate either to them or to myself each his own. This, however, is a matter of very little consequence, as I am not desirous of claiming any idea as mine that can be found elsewhere. It is enough for me if I succeed in making a tolerably clear exposition of the subject, and can induce other people to reflect upon it. End of Chapter 1.
Chapter 2 of The Night Side of Nature, or Ghosts and Ghost-Seers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Garrett Goodison. The Night Side of Nature, or Ghosts and Ghost-Seers, by Crowe. Chapter 2, The Dweller in the Temple. It is almost needless to observe that the Scriptures repeatedly speak of a man in a tripartite being, consisting of spirit, soul, and body, and that according to St. Paul, we have two bodies, a natural body and a spiritual body, the former being designed as our means of communication with the external world, an instrument to be used and controlled by our nobler parts. It is this view of it, carried to a fanaticism, which has led to the various and extraordinary mortifications recorded of ascetics. As is remarked by Reverend Hare Townshend, in a late edition of his book on mesmerism, in this fleshly body consists our organic life. In the body which we are to retain through eternity consists our fundamental life. May not the first, he says, be a temporary development of the last, just as leaves, flowers, and fruits are the temporary development of a tree? And in the same manner that these pass and drop away, yet leave the principle of reproduction behind, so may our present organs be detached from us by death, and yet the ground of our existence be spared to us continuously. Without entering into the subtle disputes of philosophers, with regard to the spirit, a subject on which there is a standing controversy between the disciples of Hegel and those of other teachers, I need only observe that the Scriptures seem to indicate what some of the heathen sages taught, that the spirit that dwells within us is the Spirit of God, incorporated in us for a period, for certain ends of his own, to be thereby wrought out. What those ends are, it does not belong to my present subject to consider. In this spirit so imparted to us, dwells, says Eschenmayer, the conscience, which keeps watch over the body and the soul, saying, Thus shalt thou do. And it is to this Christ addresses himself when he bids his disciples become perfect, like their Father in heaven. The soul is subject to the spirit, and its functions are to will or choose, to think and to feel, and to become thereby cognizant of the true, the beautiful, and the good, comprehending the highest principle, the highest ideal, and the most perfect happiness. The ego, or I, is the resultant of the three forces pneuma, psyche, soma, spirit, soul, and body. In the spirit or soul, or rather in both conjoined, dwells also the power of spiritual seeing, or intuitive knowing. For as there is a spiritual body, there is a spiritual eye, and a spiritual ear, and so forth. Or to speak more correctly, all these sensuous functions are comprised in one universal sense, which does not need the aid of the bodily organs, but, on the contrary, is most efficient when most freed from them. It remains to be seen whether, or in what degree, such separation can take place during life. Complete it cannot be till death. But whoever believes sincerely that the divine spirit dwells within him can, I should think, find no difficulty in conceiving that, although from the temporary conditions to which the spirit is subjected, this universal faculty is limited and obscured, it must still retain its indefeasible attribute. We may naturally conclude that the most perfect state of man on earth consists in the most perfect unity of the spirit and the soul. And to those who in this life have attained the nearest to that unity, will the entire assimilation of the two, after they are separated from the body, be the easiest? While to those who have lived only their intellectual and external life, this union must be extremely difficult, the soul having chosen its part with the body, and divorced itself, as much as in it lay, from the spirit. The voice of conscience is then scarcely heard, and the soul, degraded and debased, can no longer perform its functions of discerning the true, the beautiful, and the good. On these distinct functions of the soul and spirit, however, it is not my intention to insist, since it appears to me a subject on which we are not yet in a condition to dogmatize. We know rather more about our bodies by means of which the soul and spirit are united and brought into contact with the material world, and which are constructed wholly with a view to the conditions of that world, such as time, space, solidity, extension, etc., etc. But we must conceive of God as necessarily independent of these conditions. To him, all times and all places must be forever present, and it is thus that he is omniscient and omnipresent. And since we are placed by the Spirit in immediate relation with God and the spiritual world, just as we are placed by the body in immediate relation with the material world, we may, in the first place, form a notion of the possibility that some faint gleams of these inherent attributes may, at times, shoot up through the clay in which the spirit has taken up its temporary abode, and we may also admit that through the connection which exists between us and the spiritual world, it is not impossible but that we may at times and under certain conditions become cognizant of and enter into more immediate relation with it. This is the only postulate I ask, for as I said before, I do not wish to enforce opinions, but to suggest probabilities, or at least possibilities, and thus arouse reflection and inquiry. With respect to the term invisible world, I beg to remind my readers that what we call seeing is merely the function of an organ constructed for that purpose in relation to the external world, and so limited are its powers that we are surrounded by many things in that world which we cannot see without the aid of artificial appliances, and many other things which we cannot see even with them. The atmosphere in which we live, for example, although its weight and mechanical forces are the subjects of accurate calculation, is entirely imperceptible to our visual organs. Thus, the fact that we do not commonly see them forms no legitimate objection to the hypothesis of our being surrounded by a world of spirits, or of that world being interdiffused among us. Supposing the question to be decided that we do sometimes become cognizant of them, which, however, I admit it is not, since whether the apparitions are subjective or objective, that is, whether they are the mere phenomena of disease or real outstanding appearances, is the inquiry I desire to promote. But, I say, supposing that the questions were decided in the affirmative, the next that arises is, how or by what means do we see them, or, if they address us, hear them? If that universal sense which appears to me to be inseparable from the idea of spirit be once admitted, I think there can be no difficulty in answering this question. And if it be objected that we are conscious of no such sense, I answer that both in dreams and in certain abnormal states of the body, it is frequently manifested. In order to render this more clear, and at the same time to give an interesting instance of this sort of phenomenon, I will transcribe a passage from a letter of St. Augustine to his friend Evadius, Epistola 159, Antwerp edition. I will relate to you a circumstance, he writes, which will furnish your matter for reflection. Our brother Synadius, well known to us all as an eminent physician, and whom we especially love, who is now at Carthage after having distinguished himself at Rome, and whose piety and active benevolence you are well acquainted, could yet, nevertheless, as he has lately narrated to us, by no means bring himself to believe in a life after death. Now, God, doubtless, not willing that his soul should perish, there appeared to him one night in a dream a radiant youth of noble aspect, who bade him follow him, and as Synadius obeyed, they came to a city where, on the right side, he heard a chorus of the most heavenly voices. As he desired to know whence this divine harmony proceeded, the youth told him that what he heard were the songs of the blessed, whereupon he awoke, and thought no more of his dream than people usually do. On another night, however, behold, the youth appears to him again, and asks him if he knows him, and Synadius related to him all the particulars of his former dream, which he well remembered. Then, said the youth, was it while sleeping or waking that you saw these things? I was sleeping, answered Synadius. You are right, returned the youth. It was in your sleep that you saw these things, and know, O Synadius, that what you see now is also in your sleep. But if this be so, tell me, where then is your body? In my bedchamber, answered Synadius. But know you not, continued the stranger, that your eyes, which form a part of your body, are closed and inactive? I know it, answered he. Then, said the youth, with what eyes see you these things? And Synadius could not answer him. And as he hesitated, the youth spoke again, and explained to him the motive of his questions. As the eyes of your body, said he, which lies now on your bed sleeps, are inactive and useless, and yet you have eyes wherewith you see me and these things I have shown unto you, so after death, when these bodily organs fail you, you will have a vital power, whereby you will live, and a sensitive faculty, whereby you will perceive. Doubt therefore no longer that there is a life after death. And thus, said this excellent man, was I convinced, and all doubts removed. I confess there appears to me a beauty and a logical truth in this dream that I think might convince more than the dreamer. It is by the hypothesis of this universal sense latent within us, an hypothesis which, whoever believes that we are immortal spirits, incorporated for a season in a material body, can scarcely reject, that I seek to explain those perceptions which are not comprised within the functions of our bodily organs. It seems to me to be the key to all or nearly all of them, as far as our own part in the phenomena extends. But, supposing this admitted, there would then remain the difficulty of accounting for the partial and capricious glimpses we get of it, while in that department of the mystery which regards apparitions, except such as are the pure result of disease, we must grope our way with very little light to guide us, as to the conditions and motives which might possibly bring them into any immediate relation with us. To any who has been fortunate enough to witness one genuine case of clairvoyance, I think the conception of this universal sense will not be difficult, however the mode of its exercise may remain utterly incomprehensible. As I have said above, to the great Spirit and fountain of life, all things in both space and time must be present. However impossible it is to our finite minds to conceive this, we must believe it. It may, in some slight degree, facilitate the conception to remember that action, once begun, never ceases. An impulse given is transmitted on forever. A sound breathed reverberates in eternity, and thus the past is always present, although, for the purpose of fitting us for this mortal life, our ordinary senses are so constituted as to be unperceptive of these phenomena. With respect to what we call the future, it is more difficult still for us to conceive it as present. Nor, as far as I know, can we borrow from the sciences the same assistance as mechanical discoveries have just furnished me with in regard to the past. How a spirit sees that which has not yet, to our senses, taken place, seems certainly inexplicable. Foreseeing, it is not inexplicable. We foresee many things by arguing on given premises, although, from our finite views, we are always liable to be mistaken. Louis Lambert says, such events as are the product of humanity and the result of its intelligence have their own causes, in which they lie latent, just as our actions are accomplished in our thoughts previous to any outward demonstration of them. Presentiments and prophecies consist in the intuitive perception of these causes. This explanation, which is quite conformable with what of Cicero, may aid us in some degree as regards a certain small class of phenomena. But there is something involved in the question much more subtle than this. Our dreams can give us the only idea of it, for there we do actually see and hear, not only that which never was, but that which never will be. Actions and events, words and sounds, persons and places, are as clearly and vivid present to us as if they were actually what they seem, and I should think that most people must be somewhat puzzled to decide in regard to certain senses and circumstances that live in their memory, whether these images are the result of their waking or sleeping experience. Although by no means a dreamer, and without the most remote approximation to any faculty of presentiment, I know this is the case with myself. I remember also a very curious effect being produced upon me when I was abroad, some years ago, from eating the unwholesome bread to which we were reduced in consequence of scarcity. Some 5 or 6 times a day I was seized with a sort of vertigo, during which I seemed to pass through certain scenes, and was conscious of certain words which appeared to me to have a strange connection with either some former period of my life or else some previous state of existence. The words and the scenes were on each occasion precisely the same. I was always aware of that, and I always made the strongest efforts to grasp and retain them in my memory. But I could not. I only knew that the thing had been. The words and the scenes were gone. I seemed to pass momentarily into another sphere and back again. This was purely the result of disorder. But, like a dream, it shows how we may be perceptive of that which is not, and which never may be, rendering it therefore possible to conceive that a spirit may be equally perceptive of that which shall be. I am very far from meaning to imply that these examples remove the difficulty. They do not explain the thing. They only show somewhat the mode of it. But it must be remembered that when physiologists pretend to settle the whole question of apparitions by the theory of spectral illusions, they are exactly in the same predicament. They can supply examples of similar phenomena, but how a person perfectly in his senses should receive the spectral visits of not only friends, but strangers, when he is thinking of no such matter, or by what process, mental or optical, the figures are conjured up, remains as much a mystery as before a line was written on the subject. All people and all ages have believed, more or less, in prophetic dreams, presentiments, and apparitions, and all historians have furnished examples of them. That the truths may be frequently distorted and mingled with fable is no argument against those traditions. If it were, all history must be rejected on the same plea. Both the Old and New Testaments furnish numerous examples of these phenomena, and although Christ and the apostles reproved all the superstitions of the age, these persuasions are not included in their reprehensions. Neither is the comparative rarity of these phenomena any argument against their possibility. There are many strange things which occur still more rarely, but which we do not look upon as supernatural or miraculous. Of nature's ordinary laws we yet know but little, of their aberrations and perturbations still less. How should we, when the world is a miracle and life a dream, of which we know neither the beginning nor the end, we do not even know that we see anything as it is, or rather, we know that we do not. We see things but as our visual organs represent them to us, and were those organs differently constructed, the aspect of the world would to us be changed. How, then, can we pretend to decide upon what is and what is not? Nothing could be more perplexing to anyone who read them with attention than the trials for witchcraft of the 17th century. Many of the feats of the ancient thaumaturgists and wonder-workers of the temples might have been nearly as much so, but these were got rid of by the easy expedient of pronouncing them fables and impostures. But during the witch mania, so many persons proved their faith in their own miraculous powers by the sacrifice of their lives, that it was scarcely possible to doubt their having some foundation for their own persuasion, though what that foundation could be, till the late discoveries in animal magnetism, it was difficult to conceive. But here we have a new page open to us which concerns both the history of the world and the history of man as an individual, and we begin to see that which the ignorant thought supernatural, and the wise impossible, has been both natural and true. While the scientific men of Great Britain and several of our journalists have been denying and ridiculing the reports of these phenomena, the most eminent physicians of Germany have been quietly studying and investigating them, and giving to the world in their works the results of their experience. Among the rest, Dr. Joseph Ennemoser of Berlin has presented to us in 2 books on magic and on the connection of magnetism with nature and religion, the fruits of his 30 years' study of this subject, during the course of which he has had repeated opportunities of investigating all the phenomena and of making himself perfectly familiar with even the most rare and perplexing. To anyone who has studied these works, the mysteries of the temples and of the witch trials are mysterious no longer, and he writes with the professed design not to make science mystical, but to bring the mysterious within the bounds of science. The phenomena, as he justly says, are as old as the human race. Animal magnetism is no new development, no new discovery. Inseparable from life, although like many other vital phenomena, so subtle in its influences that only in abnormal cases it attracts attention, it has exhibited itself more or less in all ages and in all countries. But its value as a medical agent is only now beginning to dawn on the civilized world, while its importance in a higher point of view is yet perceived by but few. Every human being who has ever withdrawn himself from strife and the turmoil and the distraction of the world without, in order to look within, must have found himself perplexed by 1,000 questions with regard to his own being, which he would find no one able to solve. In the study of animal magnetism, he will first obtain some gleams of a light which will show him that he is indeed the child of God, and that, though a dweller on the earth, and fallen, some traces of his divine descent, and of his unbroken connection with the higher order of being, still remain to comfort and encourage him. He will find that there exists in his species the germs of faculties that are never fully unfolded here on earth, and which have no reference in this state of being. They exist in all men, but in most cases are so faintly elicited as not to be observable, and when they do shoot up here and there, they are denied, disowned, misinterpreted, and maligned. It is true that their development is often the symptom and effect of disease, which seems to change the relations of our material and immaterial parts. It is true that some of the phenomena resulting from these faculties are stimulated by disease, as is in the case of spectral illusions. And it is true that imposture and folly intrude their unhallowed footsteps into this domain of science, as into that of all others. But there is a deep and holy well of truth to be discovered in this neglected bypath of nature, by those who seek it, from which they may draw the purest consolations for the present, the most ennobling hopes for the future, and the most valuable aid in penetrating through the letter into the spirit of the Scriptures. I confess, it makes me sorrowful when I hear men laughing, scorning, and denying this, their birthright, and I cannot but grieve to think how closely and heavily their clay must be wrapped about them, and how the external and sensuous life must have prevailed over the internal, when no gleam from within breaks through to show them that these things are true. End of Chapter 2. Recording by Garrett Goodison.
Chapter 3 of The Night Side of Nature, or Ghosts and Ghost-Seers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Amy Graymore. The Night Side of Nature, or Ghosts and Ghost-Seers, by Catherine Crowe. Chapter 3. Waking and Sleeping, and how the dweller in the temple sometimes looks abroad. To begin with the most simple, or rather I should say the most ordinary, class of phenomena, for we can scarcely call that simple, the mystery of which we have never been able to penetrate, I mean dreaming, everybody's experience will suffice to satisfy them that their ordinary dreams take place in a state of imperfect sleep, and that this imperfect sleep may be caused by any bodily or mental derangement whatever, or even from an ill-made bed, or too much or too little covering, and it is not difficult to conceive that the strange, confused, and disjointed visions we are subject to on these occasions may proceed from some parts of the brain being less at rest than the others, so that, assuming phrenology to be fact, one organ is not in a state to correct the impressions of another. Of such vain and insignificant visions I need scarcely say it is not my intention to treat. But at the same time I must observe, that when we have admitted the above explanation, as far as it goes, we have not, even in regard to them, made much progress toward removing the difficulty. If dreaming resembled thinking, the explanations might be quite satisfactory, but the truth is, that dreaming is not thinking, as we think in our waking state, but is more analogous to thinking in delirium or acute mania, or in that chronic condition which gives rise to sensuous illusions. In our ordinary normal state, conceiving of places or persons does not enable us to see them or hold communion with them, nor do we fancy that we do either. It is true that I have heard some painters say that, by closing their eyes and concentrating their thoughts on an object, they can bring it more or less vividly before them, and Blake professed actually to see his sitters when they were not present. But whatever interpretations we may put upon this curious faculty, his case was clearly abnormal, and connected with some personal peculiarity, either physical or psychical, and, after making the most of it, it must be admitted that it can enter into no sort of comparison with that we possess in sleep, when, in our most ordinary dreams, untrammelled by time or space, we visit the uttermost ends of the earth, fly in the air, swim in the sea, listen to beautiful music and eloquent orations, behold the most charming as well as the most loathsome objects, and not only see, but converse with our friends, absent or present, dead or alive. Every one, I think, will grant that there is the widest possible difference between conceiving of these things when awake, and dreaming them. When we dream, we do, we see, we say, we hear, etc. and etc. That is, we believe at the time we do so. And what more can be said of us when we are awake than that we believe we are doing, seeing, saying, hearing, etc. It is by external circumstances and the result of our actions that we are able to decide whether we have actually done a thing, or seen a place, or only dreamt that we had done so. And as I have said above, after some lapse of time we are not always able to distinguish between the two. While dreaming we frequently ask ourselves whether we are awake or asleep, and nothing is more common than to hear people say, "Well, I think I did or heard so and so, but I'm not sure whether it was so or whether I dreamt it." Thus, therefore, the very lowest order of dreaming, the most disjointed and perplexed, is far removed from the most vivid presentations of our waking thoughts; and it is in this respect, I think, that the explanations of the phenomena hitherto offered by phrenologists and the metaphysicians of this country are inadequate and unsatisfactory. While as regards the analogy between the visions of sleep and delirium, whatever similarity there may be in the effects, we cannot suppose the cause to be identical; since in delirium the images and delusions are the result of excessive action of the brain, which we must conclude to be the very reverse of its conditions in sleep. Pinel certainly has hazarded an opinion that sleep is occasioned by an efflux of blood to the head, and consequent compression of the brain; a theory which would have greater weight were sleep more strictly periodical than it is, but which at present it seems impossible to reconcile with many established facts. Some of the German physiologists and psychologists have taken a deeper view of this question of dreaming, from considering it in connection with the phenomena of animal magnetism; and although their theories differ in some respects, they all unite in looking toward that department of nature for instruction; while one section of these inquirers, the Exegetical Society of Stockholm included, calls in the aid of supernatural agency; another, among whom Dr. Joseph Ennemoser of Berlin appears to be one of the most eminent, maintains that the explanation of the mystery is to be chiefly sought in the great and universal law of polarity, which extends not only beyond the limits of this earth, but beyond the limits of this system, which must necessarily be in connection with all others, so that there is thus an eternal and never ceasing interaction, of which, from the multiplicity and contrariety of the influences, we are insensible, just as we are insensible to the pressure of the atmosphere, from its impinging on us equally on all sides. Waking and sleeping are the day and night sides of organic life, during which alternations an animal is placed in different relations to the external world, and to these alternations all organisms are subject. The completeness and independence of each individual organism are an exact ratio to the number and completeness of the organs it develops; and thus the locomotive animal has the advantage of the plant or the zoophyte, while of the animal kingdom man is the most complete and independent, and although still a member of the universal whole, and therefore incapable of isolating himself, yet better able than any other organism to ward off external influences, and comprise his world within himself. But according to Dr. Ennemoser, one of the consequences of this very completeness is a weak and insignificant development of instinct; and thus the healthy waking conscious man is, of all organisms, the least sensible to the impressions of this universal intercommunication and polarity, although, at the same time partaking of the nature of the plant and the animal, he is subject, like the first, to all manner of atmospheric, telluric, and periodic influences, and frequently exhibits, like the second, peculiar instinctive appetites and desires, and in some individual organizations, very marked antipathies and susceptibilities with regard to certain objects and influences, even when not placed in any evident relation with them. According to this theory, sleep is a retrograde step, a retreating into a lower sphere, in which condition the sensuous functions being in abeyance, the instincts somewhat resume their sway. In sleep and in sickness, he says, the higher animals and man fall in a physico-organical point of view from their individual independence, or power of self-sustainment, and their polar relation, that is, their relation to the healthy and waking man, becomes changed from a positive to a negative one, all men in regard to each other, as well as all nature, being the subjects of this polarity. It is to be remembered that this theory of Dr. Ennemoser's was promulgated before the discoveries of Baron von Reichenbach in magnetism were made public, and the susceptibility to magnetic influences in the animal organism, which the experiments of the latter go to establish, is certainly in its favour. But while it pretends to explain the condition of the sleepers, and may possibly be of some service in our investigations into the mystery of dreaming, it leaves us as much in the dark as ever, with respect to the cause of our falling into this negative state, an inquiry in which little progress seems to have been hitherto made. With respect to dreaming, Dr. Ennemoser rejects the physiological theory which maintains that in sleep, magnetic or otherwise, the activity of the brain is transferred to the ganglionic system, and that the former falls into a subordinate relation. Dreaming, he says, is the gradual awakening of activity in the organs of imagination, whereby the presentation of sensuous objects to the spirit, which had been discontinued in profound sleep, is resumed. Dreaming, he adds, also arises from the secret activity of the spirit in the innermost sensuous organs of the brain, busying the fancy with subjective sensuous images, the objective conscious day life giving place to the creative dominion of the poetical genius, to which night becomes day, and universal nature its theatre of action. And thus the supersensuous or transcendent nature of the spirit becomes more manifest in dreaming than in the waking state. But in considering these phenomena, man must be viewed in both his psychical and physical relations, and as equally subject to spiritual as to natural operations and influences. Since, during the continuance of life, neither soul nor body can act quite independently of the other, for although it be the immortal spirit which perceives, it is through the instrumentality of the sensuous organs that it does so. For of absolute spirit without body we can form no conception. What is here meant seems to be that the brain becomes the world to the spirit, before the impressions from the external world do actually come streaming through by means of the external sensuous organs. The inner spiritual light illumines, till the outward physical light overpowers and extinguishes it. But in this state the brain, which is the storehouse of acquired knowledge, is not in a condition to apply its acquisitions effectively, while the intuitive knowledge of the spirit, if the sleep be imperfect, is clouded by its interference. Other physiologists, however, believe, from the numerous and well-attested cases of the transference of the senses in disease to the pit of the stomach, that the activity of the brain in sleep is transferred to the epigastric region. The instances of this phenomenon, as related by Dr. Petitin and others, have been frequently published. I need not here quote. But as Dr. Passavant observes, it is well known that the functions of the nerves differ in some animals, and that one set can supply the place of another, as in those cases where there is a great susceptibility to light, though no eyes can be discovered. These physiologists believe that, even during the most profound sleep, the spirit retains its activity, a proposition which, indeed, we can not doubt. It wakes, though the senses sleep, retreating into its infinite depths, like the sun at night, living on its spiritual life undisturbed, while the body sinks into a state of vegetative tranquillity. Nor does it follow that the soul is unconscious in sleep, because in waking we have frequently lost all memory of its consciousness. Since by the repose of the sensuous organs the bridge between waking and sleeping is removed, and the recollections of one state are not carried into the other. It will occur here to everyone, how often in the instant of waking we are not only conscious that we have been dreaming, but are also conscious of the subject of the dream, which we try in vain to grasp, but which eludes us and is gone for ever the moment we have passed into a state of complete wakefulness. Now, with respect to this so-called dreaming in profound sleep, it is a thing no one can well doubt who thoroughly believes that his body is a temple built for the dwelling of an immortal spirit. For we cannot conceive of spirit sleeping, or needing that restoration which we know to be the condition of earthly organisms. If therefore the spirit wakes, may we not suppose that the more it is disentangled from the obstructions of the body, the more clear will be its perceptions, and that therefore, in the profound natural sleep of the sensuous organs, we may be in a state of clear seeing? All who have attended to the subject are aware that the clear seeing of magnetic patients depends on the depth of their sleep. Whatever circumstance, internal or external, tends to interrupt this profound repose of the sensuous organs, inevitably obscures their perceptions. Again, with respect to the not carrying with us the recollections of one state into the other, should not this lead us to suspect that sleeping and waking are two different spheres of existence, partaking of the nature of that double life, of which the records of human physiology have presented us with various instances, wherein a patient finds himself utterly divested of all recollection of past events and acquired knowledge, and has to begin life and education anew, till another transition takes place, wherein he recovers what he had lost, while he at the same time loses all he had lately gained, which he only recovers once more by another transition, restoring him to his lately acquired knowledge, but again obliterating his original stock, thus alternately passing from one state to the other, and disclosing a double life. An educated man in one condition, a child learning his alphabet in the next. Where the transition from one state to another is complete, memory is entirely lost. But there are cases in which the change being either gradual or modified, the recollections of one life are carried more or less into the other. We know this to be the case with magnetic sleepers, as it is with ordinary dreamers, and most persons have met with instances of the dream of one night being continued in the next. Trevor mentions the case of a student who regularly began to talk the moment he fell asleep, the subject of his discourse being a dream, which he always took up at the exact point at which he had left it the previous morning. Of this dream he had never the slightest recollection in his waking state. A daughter of Sir George Mackenzie, who died at an early age, was endowed with a remarkable genius for music, and was an accomplished organist. This young lady dreamed, during an illness, that she was at a party, where she had heard a new piece of music, which made so great an impression on her by its novelty and beauty, that on awaking she besought her attendants to bring her some paper, that she might write it down before she had forgotten it, an indulgence which, apprehensive of excitement, her medical attendant unfortunately forbade. For apart from the additional psychological interest that would have been attached to the fact, the effects of compliance, judging from what ensued, would probably have been soothing rather than otherwise. About 10 days afterward, she had a second dream, wherein she again found herself at a party, where she descried on the desk of a pianoforte in a corner of the room an open book, in which with astonished delight she recognized the same piece of music, which she immediately proceeded to play, and then awoke. The piece was not of a short or fugitive character, but in the style of an overture. The question of course remains as to whether she was composing the music in her sleep, or by an act of clairvoyance was perceiving some that actually existed. Either is possible, for although she might have been incapable of composing so elaborate a piece in her waking state, there are many instances on record of persons performing intellectual feats in dreams to which they were unequal when awake. A very eminent person assured me that he had once composed some lines in his sleep, I think it was a sonnet, which far exceeded any of his waking performances of that description. Somewhat analogous to this sort of double life is the case of the young girl mentioned by Dr. Abercrombie and others, whose employment was keeping cattle, and who slept for some time, much to her own annoyance, in the room adjoining one occupied by an itinerant musician. The man, who played exceedingly well, being an enthusiast in his art, frequently practised the greater part of the night, performing on his violin very complicated and difficult compositions, while the girl, so far from discovering any pleasure in his performances, complained bitterly of being kept awake by the noise. Some time after this she fell ill, and was removed to the house of a charitable lady, who undertook the charge of her. And here, by and by, the family were amazed by frequently hearing the most exquisite music in the night, which they at length discovered to proceed from the girl. The sounds were those of a violin, and the tuning and other preliminary processes were accurately imitated. She went through long and elaborate pieces, and afterward was heard imitating in the same way the sounds of a pianoforte that was in the house. She also talked very cleverly on the subjects of religion and politics, and discussed with great judgment the characters and conduct of persons public and private. Awake she knew nothing of these things, but was, on the contrary, stupid, heavy, and had no taste whatever for music. Phrenology would probably interpret this phenomenon by saying that the lower elements of the cerebral spinal axis, as organs of sensation, etc., etc., being asleep, the cluster of the higher organs requisite for the above combinations were not only awake, but rendered more active from the repose of the others. But to me it appears that we here see the inherent faculties of the spirit manifesting themselves. While the body slept, the same faculties must have existed when it was in the waking state. But the impressions and manifestations were then dependent on the activity and perfection of the sensuous organs, which seem to have been of an inferior order, and consequently no rays of this indwelling genius could pierce the coarse integument in which it was lodged. Similar unexpected faculties have been not unfrequently manifested by the dying, and we may conclude to a certain degree from the same cause, namely, that the incipient death of the body is leaving the spirit more unobstructed. Dr. Steinbeck mentions the case of a clergyman, who being summoned to administer the last sacraments to a dying peasant, found him, to his surprise, praying aloud in Greek and Hebrew, a mystery which could be no otherwise explained than by the circumstance of his having, when a child, frequently heard the then minister of the parish praying in those languages. He had, however, never understood the prayers, nor indeed paid any attention to them. Still less had he been aware that they lived in his memory. It would give much additional interest to this story, had Dr. Steinbeck mentioned how far the man now, while uttering the words, understood their meaning, whether he was aware of what he was saying, or was only repeating the words by rote. With regard to the extraordinary faculty of memory manifested in these and similar cases, I shall have some observations to make in a subsequent part of this book. Parallel instances are those of idiots who, either in a somnambulic state, or immediately previous to death, have spoken as if inspired. At St. Jean de Maurienne, in Savoy, there was a dumb cretin, who, having fallen into a normal state of somnambulism, not only was found to speak with ease, but also to the purpose; a faculty which disappeared, however, whenever he awoke. Dumb persons have likewise been known to speak when at the point of death. The possibility of suggesting dreams to some sleepers by whispering in the ear is a well-known fact, but this can doubtless only be practicable when the sensuous organs are partly awake. Then, as with magnetic patients in a state of incomplete sleep, we have only reverie and imagination in place of clear seeing. The next class of dreams are those which partake of the nature of second sight, or prophecy, and of these there are various kinds, some being plain and literal in their premonitions, others allegorical and obscure, while some also regard the most unimportant, and others the most grave, events of our lives. A gentleman engaged in business in the south of Scotland, for example, dreams that on entering his office in the morning he sees seated on a certain stool a person formerly in his service as clerk, of whom he had neither heard nor thought for some time. He inquires the motive of the visit, and is told that such and such circumstances have brought the stranger to that part of the country. He could not forbear visiting his old quarters, expressing at the same time a wish to spend a few days in his former occupation, etc., etc. The gentleman, being struck with the vividness of the illusion, relates his dream at breakfast, and, to his surprise, on going to his office, there sits the man, and the dialogue that ensues is precisely that of the dream. I have heard of numerous instances of this kind of dream, where no previous expectation nor excitement of mind could be found to account for them, and where the fulfilment was too exact and literal, in all particulars, to admit of their being explained away by the ready resource of an extraordinary coincidence. There are also on record, in both this country and others, many perfectly well authenticated cases of people obtaining prizes in the lottery through having dreamed of the fortunate numbers. As many numbers, however, may have been dreamed of that were not drawn prizes, we can derive no conclusion from this circumstance. A very remarkable instance of this kind of dreaming occurred a few years since to Mr. A. F., an eminent Scotch advocate, while staying in the neighbourhood of Loch Fyne, who dreamed one night that he saw a number of people in the street following a man to the scaffold. He discovered the features of the criminal in the cart distinctly, and for some reason or other, which he could not account for, felt an extraordinary interest in his fate, and so much that he joined the throng, and accompanied him to the place that was to terminate his earthly career. This interest was the more unaccountable, that the man had an exceedingly unprepossessing countenance, but it was nevertheless so vivid as to induce the dreamer to ascend the scaffold, and address him, with a view to enable him to escape the impending catastrophe. Suddenly, however, while he was talking to him, the whole scene dissolved away, and the sleeper awoke. Being a good deal struck with the lifelike reality of the vision, and the impression made on his mind by the features of this man, he related the circumstance to his friends at breakfast, adding that he should know him anywhere if he saw him. A few jests being made on the subject, the thing was forgotten. On the afternoon of the same day, the advocate was informed that two men wanted to speak to him, and on going into the hall, he was struck with amazement at perceiving that one of them was the hero of his dream. "We are accused of a murder," said they, "and we wish to consult you. 3 of us went out last night in a boat. An accident has happened. Our comrade is drowned, and they want to make us accountable for him." The advocate then put some interrogations to them, and the result produced in his mind, by their answers, was a conviction of their guilt. Probably the recollection of his dream rendered the effects of this conviction more palpable, for one addressing the other, said in Gaelic, "We have come to the wrong man. He is against us." "There is a higher power than I against you," returned the gentleman, "and the only advice I can give you is, if you are guilty, fly immediately." Upon this they went away, and the next thing he heard was that they were taken into custody on suspicion of the murder. The account of the affair was, that, as they said, the 3 had gone out together on the preceding evening, and that in the morning the body of one of them had been found on the shore, with a cut across his forehead. The father and the friend of the victim had waited on the banks of the lake till the boat came in, and then demanded their companion, of whom, however, they professed themselves unable to give any account. Upon this the old man led them to his cottage for the purpose of showing them the body of his son. One entered, and at the sight of it burst into a passion of tears. The other refused to do so, saying his business called him immediately home, and went sulkily away. This last was the man seen in the dream. After a fortnight's incarceration, the former of these was liberated, and he then declared to the advocate his intention of bringing an action of damages for false imprisonment. He was advised not to do it. "Leave well alone," said the lawyer, "and if you'll take my advice, make off while you can." The man, however, refused to fly. He declared that he really did not know what had occasioned the death of his comrade. The latter had been at one end of the boat, and he at the other. When he looked round, he was gone, but whether he had fallen overboard and cut his head as he fell, or whether he had been struck and pushed into the water, he did not know. The advocate became finally satisfied of this man's innocence, but the authorities, thinking it absurd to try one and not the other, again laid hands on him, and it fell to Mr. A. F. to be the defender of both. The difficulty was, not to separate their cases in his pleading, for however morally convinced of the different ground on which they stood, his duty, professionally, was to obtain the acquittal of both, in which he finally succeeded, as regarded the charge of murder. They were, therefore, sentenced to 2 years' imprisonment, and, so far as the dream is concerned, here ends the story. There remains, however, a curious sequel to it. A few years afterward, the same gentleman being in a boat on Loch Fyne, in company with Sir T—d—l, happened to be mentioning these curious circumstances, when one of the boatmen said that he knew well about those two men, and that a very strange thing had occurred in regard to one of them. This one, on inquiry, proved to be the subject of the dream, and the strange thing was this: on being liberated, he had quitted that part of the country, and in process of time had gone to Greenock, and thence embarked in a vessel for Cork. But the vessel seemed fated never to reach its destination. One misfortune happened after another, till at length the sailors said, "This won't do, there must be a murderer on board with us." As is usual when such a persuasion exists, they drew lots 3 times, and each time it fell on that man. He was consequently put on shore, and the vessel went on its way without him. What had become of him afterward was not known. A friend of mine being in London, dreamed that she saw her little boy playing on the terrace of her house in Northumberland, that he fell and hurt his arm, and she saw him lying apparently dead. The dream recurred 2 or 3 times on the same night, and she awoke her husband, saying she feared something must have happened to Henry. In due course of post, a letter arrived from the governess, saying that she was sorry to have to communicate that while playing on the terrace that morning, Master Henry had fallen over a heap of stones and broken his arm, adding that he had fainted after the accident, and had lain for some time insensible. The lady to whom this dream occurred is not aware having ever manifested this faculty before or since. Mrs. W. dreamed that she saw people ascending by a ladder to the chamber of her stepson John. Wakes, and she says she is afraid he is dead, and that there was something odd in her dream about a watch and a candle. In the morning a messenger is sent to inquire for the gentleman, and they find people ascending to his chamber window by a ladder, the door of the room being locked. They discover him dead on the floor, with his watch in his hand, and the candle between his feet. The same lady dreamed that she saw a friend in great agony, and that she heard him say they were tearing his flesh from his bones. He was some time afterwards seized with inflammation, lay as she had seen him, and made use of those exact words. A friend of mine dreamed lately that somebody said her nephew must not be bled, as it would be dangerous. The young man was quite well, and there had been no design of bleeding him, but on the following morning he had a tooth drawn, and an effusion of blood ensued, which lasted some days, and caused a good deal of uneasiness. A farmer in Worcestershire dreamed that his little boy of 12 years old had fallen from the waggon and was killed. The dream recurred 3 times in one night, but unwilling to yield to superstitious fears, he allowed the child to accompany the waggoner to Kidderminster fair. The driver was very fond of the boy, and he felt assured would take care of him. But having occasion to go a little out of the road to leave a parcel, the man bade the child walk on with the waggon, and he would meet him at a certain spot. On arriving there, the horses were coming quietly forward, but the boy was not with them, and on retracing the road he was found dead, having apparently fallen from the shafts and been crushed by the wheels. A gentleman who resided near one of the Scottish lakes dreamt that he saw a number of persons surrounding a body which had just been drawn out of the water. On approaching the spot, he perceived that it is himself, and the assistants are his own friends and retainers. Alarmed at the lifelike reality of the vision, he resolved to elude the threatened destiny, by never venturing on the lake again. On one occasion, however, it became quite indispensable that he should do so, and as the day was quite calm, he yielded to the necessity, on condition that he should be put ashore at once on the opposite side, while the rest of the party proceeded to their destinations, where he would meet them. This was accordingly done. The boat skimmed gaily over the smooth waters, and arrived safely at the rendezvous, the gentlemen laughing at the superstition of their companion, while he stood smiling on the bank to receive them. But alas, the fates were inexorable. The little promontory that supported him had been undermined by the water. It gave way beneath his feet, and life was extinct before he could be rescued. This circumstance was related to me by a friend of the family. Mr. S. was the son of an Irish bishop, who set somewhat more value on the things of this world than became his function. He had always told his son that there was but one thing he could not forgive, and that was a bad marriage, meaning by a bad marriage a poor one. As cautions of this sort do not, by any means, prevent young people falling in love, Mr. S. fixed his affections on Lady O, a fair young widow, without any fortune; and aware that it would be useless to apply for his father's consent, he married her without asking it. They were consequently exceedingly poor, and indeed nearly all they had to live on was a small sinecure of £40 per annum, which Dean Swift procured for him. While in this situation, Mr. S. dreamed one night that he was in the cathedral in which he had formerly been accustomed to attend service; that he saw a stranger, habited as a bishop, occupying his father's throne; and that, on applying to the verger for an explanation, the man said that the bishop was dead, and that he had expired just as he was adding a codicil to his will in his son's favour. The impression made by the dream was so strong, that Mr. S. felt that he should have no repose till he had obtained news from home; and as the most speedy way of doing so was to go there himself, he started on horseback, much against the advice of his wife, who attached no importance whatever to the circumstance. He had scarcely accomplished half his journey, when he met a courier bearing the intelligence of his father's death; and when he reached home, he found that there was a codicil attached to the will, of the greatest importance to his own future prospects. But the old gentleman had expired with the pen in his hand just as he was about to sign it. In this unhappy position, reduced to hopeless indigence, the friends of the young man proposed that he should present himself at the vice-regal palace on the next levee day, in hopes that some interest might be excited in his favour, to which, with reluctance, he consented. As he was ascending the stairs, he was met by a gentleman, whose dress indicated that he belonged to the church. "Good heavens!" said he to the friend who accompanied him, "who is that?" "That is Mr. of so and so." "Then he will be the bishop of L," returned Mr. S., "for that is the man I saw occupying my father's throne." "Impossible," replied the other; "he has no interest whatever, and has no more chance of being a bishop than I have." "You will see," replied Mr. S., "I am certain he will." They had made their obeisance above, and were returning, when there was a great cry without, and everybody rushed to the doors and windows to inquire what had happened. The horses attached to the carriage of a young nobleman had become restive, and were endangering the life of their master, when Mr. rushed forward, and at the peril of his own seized their heads, and afforded Lord C. time to descend, before they broke through all restraint and dashed away. Through the interest of this nobleman and his friends, to whom Mr. had been previously quite unknown, he obtained the see of L. These circumstances were related to me by a member of the family. It would be tedious to relate all the instances of this sort of dreaming which have come to my knowledge. But were they even much more rare than they are, and were there none of a graver and more mysterious kind, it might certainly occasion some surprise that they should have excited so little attention. When stories of this sort are narrated, they are listened to with wonder for the moment, and then forgotten, and few people reflect on the deep significance of the facts, or the important consequences to us involved in the question of how, with our limited faculties, which cannot foretell the events of the next moment, we should suddenly become prophets and seers. The following dream, as it regards the fate of a very interesting person, and is, I believe, very little known, I will relate, though the story is of somewhat an old date. Major André, the circumstances of whose lamented death are too well known to make it necessary for me to detail them here, was a friend of Miss Seward's, and previously to his embarkation for America, he made a journey into Derbyshire to pay her a visit, and it was arranged that they should ride over to see the wonders of the Peak, and introduce André to Newton, her minstrel, as she called him, and to Mr. Cunningham, the curate, who was also a poet. While these two gentlemen were awaiting the arrival of their guests, of whose intentions they had been apprized, Mr. Cunningham mentioned to Newton that on the preceding night he had had a very extraordinary dream, which he could not get out of his head. He had fancied himself in a forest. The place was strange to him, and while looking about he perceived a horseman approaching at great speed, who had scarcely reached the spot where the dreamer stood, when 3 men rushed out of the thicket, and seizing his bridle, hurried him away, after closely searching his person. The countenance of the stranger being very interesting, the sympathy felt by the sleeper for his apparent misfortune awoke him. But he presently fell asleep again, and dreamed that he was standing near a great city, among thousands of people, and that he saw the same person he had seen seized in the wood, brought out, and suspended to a gallows. When André and Miss Seward arrived, he was horror struck to perceive that his new acquaintance was the antitype of the man in the dream. Mr. C, a friend of mine, told me the other day that he had dreamed he had gone to see a lady of his acquaintance, and that she had presented him with a purse. In the morning he mentioned the circumstance to his wife, adding that he wondered what should have made him dream of a person he had not been in any way led to think of, and above all, that she should give him a purse. On the same day a letter arrived from that lady to Mrs. C, containing a purse, of which she begged her acceptance. Here was the imperfect foreshadowing of the fact, probably from unsound sleep. Another friend lately dreamed, one Thursday night, that he saw an acquaintance of his thrown from his horse, and that he was lying on the ground, with the blood streaming from his face, which was much cut. He mentioned his dream in the morning, and being an entire disbeliever in such phenomena, he could not account for the impression made on his mind. This was so strong that on Saturday he could not forbear calling at his friend's house, who, he was told, was in bed, having been thrown from his horse on the previous day, and much injured about the face. Relations of this description have been more or less familiar to the world in all times and places, and the recurrence of the phenomena too frequent to admit of their reality being disputed. Various theories were promulgated to account for them, and indeed there scarcely seems to be a philosopher or historian among the Greeks and Romans who does not make some allusion to this ill understood department of nature. While, among the Eastern nations, the faith in such mysterious revelations remains even yet undiminished. Spirits, good and evil, or the divinities of the heathen mythology, were generally called in to remove the difficulty, though some philosophers, rejecting this supernatural interference, sought the explanation in merely physical causes. In the druidical rites of the northern nations, women bore a considerable part. They were priestesses, who gave forth oracles and prophecies much after the manner of the Pythonesses of the Grecian temples, and no doubt drawing their inspiration from the same sources, namely, from the influences of magnetism and from narcotics. When the pure rites of Christianity superseded the heathen forms of worship, tradition kept alive the memory of these vaticinations, together with some of the arcana of the druidical groves, and hence, in the Middle Ages, arose the race of so-called witches and sorcerers, who were partly impostors and partly self-deluded. Nobody thought of seeking the explanation of the facts they witnessed in natural causes. What had formerly been attributed to the influence of the gods was now attributed to the influence of the devil, and a league with Satan was the universal solvent of all difficulties. Persecution followed, of course, and men, women, and children were offered up to the demon of superstition, till the candid and rational part of mankind, taking fright at the holocaust, began to put in their protest, and lead out a reaction, which, like all reactions, ran right into the opposite extreme. From believing everything, they ceased to believe anything, and after swallowing unhesitatingly the most monstrous absurdities, they relieved themselves of the whole difficulty by denying the plainest facts, while what it was impossible to deny was referred to imagination, that most abused word, which explained nothing, but left the matter as obscure as it was before. Man's spiritual nature was forgotten, and what the senses could not apprehend, nor the understanding account for, was pronounced to be impossible. Thank God we have lived through that age, and in spite of the struggles of the materialistic school, we are fast advancing to a better. The traditions of the saints who suffered the most appalling tortures, and slept or smiled the while, can scarcely be rejected now, when we are daily hearing of people undergoing frightful operations, either in a state of insensibility, or while they believe themselves revelling in delight. Nor can the psychological intimations which these facts offer be much longer overlooked. One revelation must lead to another, and the wise men of the world will, ere long, be obliged to give in their adherence to Shakespeare's much quoted axiom, and confess that there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in their philosophy. CHAPTER 4